Diary of a Dean, published by Hamilton Books, and The Decline and Revival of Higher Education, published by Transaction. Herb's latest books, which add to an impressive opus of some 24 books he has written or edited, are not only an analysis of cultural changes in higher education over the past half-century, but also a highly personal account of his own distinguished career in academia. Herbert London has been president of Hudson Institute for 13 years, and he is also the founder of New York University's Gallatin School of Individualized Study. Diary of a Dean is a memoir of London's years at NYU during a tumultuous era. Decline and Revival in Higher Education offers a glimpse into the devolution of university standards. I want to point out that both books are available for purchase at the back of the room, and Herb will be delighted to sign copies after the event. Joining Herb today to discuss the current state of higher education is Ann Neal, co-founder and president of the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. I will now turn the platform over to Ann, and please join me in welcoming our two distinguished speakers.
Thank you so much. Well, I must say it is truly a treat for me today to be introducing Herb London for this book discussion. Now, Herb, as you all know, for nearly 40 years has been on the front lines of higher ed reform. He is an incisive, eloquent commentator on what is wrong with higher education. Now, what I think is important to remember, however, and is indeed important to remember when we talk about higher education reform, is that Herb is not just an attack dog, although I must admit he can be quite good at that. But what is good to remember, and we can find it in his title, Decline and Revival in Higher Education, is that he is someone who looks not only on what can be better, but he looks ahead to the revival and the good that we will soon find. Herb London is speaking out on higher education not because he has an antipathy to it, but because he has a great love for it. Now, his own story, and I think you're going to hear a little bit more from him today about this, is one of a young boy, an aspiring jock, if you will, whose life is transformed by engagement with great books, classic texts, and the best that has been done and written. Who could be more aware of what a quality higher education can be and do, the transformative, liberating experience of a truly rich liberal arts education, than Herb London? Now, we all know that great old line from Woodrow Wilson. When asked why he was leaving the presidency of Princeton to run for governor and president, he said he wanted to get out of politics. And I think in this case, aren't we lucky indeed that when Herb ran for mayor and governor, voters allowed Herb to stay in politics, to stay in the fray that we know as higher education reform. As I prepared today for this discussion, I was struck over and over again by Herb's remarkable prescience and his ability to blend practicality with real vision. I think it's fair to say that Herb was one of the very first to raise the alarm about troubling trends in academia and to point the way toward revival, as he puts it, of a, quote, robust and clear-sighted liberalism. In his book, which he'll talk about today, he outlines, I think, very eloquently some of the real challenges to higher education and the degradation that we have seen in the last 20 or 30 years. Declining academic standards, grade inflation, perversion of academic freedom, and what he rightly points out are often threats to academic freedom from within, not from without. He chronicles the politicization of the classroom and the tendentiousness of many postmodern subjects, the realization that for-profits are going to disrupt the higher education landscape, and quite accurately he predicts that they will not be welcome. He rightly points out that the centralization of government makes educated citizenry even more important, and points out again why our democratic republic requires us to understand free institutions and individual liberties. And he notes that retrenchment has its virtues. Now, in many respects, when Herb first started putting pen to paper, he was a lone voice in the wilderness. But as is so often the case, his analysis is now becoming the consensus view. It has been adopted and endorsed by many inside and outside the academy. If you look at Herb's books and other books in higher ed, I would submit that we are on the verge of a significant change in attitude toward higher ed, which could have far-ranging consequences. Authors as different as Andrew Hacker on Higher Ed, Craig Brandon, The 5-Year Party, Harry Lewis in Excellence Without a Soul, Anthony Kronman in Education's End, have all been Cassandras. The prestige and automatic deference that higher ed has received over the years is no longer a given, particularly as we see dependence upon unrealistic and irresponsible levels of personal indebtedness. What we are seeing is a growing acknowledgement of the decline and prospects for revival. Now, I am happy to say that the American Council of Trustees and Alumni is riding this wave. And at Herb's request, I'm pleased to give a heads up that on Monday we will be issuing a massive report whose results do not bode well for American competitiveness or for our Republican institutions, which presuppose an informed citizenry. Need I say, most colleges and universities are not going to like the results of our upcoming What Will They Learn analysis. Our findings, which grade more than 700 institutions based on the strength of their curriculum, find that universities have, on the whole, abdicated their responsibility to direct students to the most important subjects they need for success after graduation. Now, allow me to stress that this is not a study of higher ed for insiders. We take our cues from complaints of business leaders that college graduates can't write a paragraph or analyze complex prose. Our report ties these worrisome findings to universities' failure to ensure graduates know what they need to know. We're fine-tuning the results, but we can say that students can graduate without taking a single broad class in economics or American government or attaining proficiency in foreign language. Like Herb, we believe students deserve better, and like Herb, we believe that we can obtain revival by turning to engaged trustees, informed parents, and informed policymakers who can help redirect higher ed to its higher mission, education. These are mighty exciting times in higher ed reform. We're on the cusp of real change and real revival, and I'm pleased that Herb's going to be talking to us about that today.
I should say right at the outset that Ann Neal is the Joan of Arc in higher education. There is no one that I know who's generated more energy and has done more to introduce alumni members and trustees to the changes that are necessary in higher education. So for me, it's a real treat to be on the same platform with Ann, who I regard as an extraordinary missionary in this effort. Now let me just make a couple of disclaimers before I engage in my formal remarks. The first of these disclaimers is that while I've been critical of higher education, it's also fair to say that the higher education institutions in the United States are among the finest in the world. We have some of the best engineering programs, some of the most extraordinary mathematical programs, some of the great computer efforts, and in fact some of the most significant innovations. But it's also true if you look at the soft sciences and you examine the humanities, you see where the corruption exists. In fact, one of the titles that I was often thinking about in these two books that they've been brought before your attention is The Corruption of Higher Education, from Cardinal Newman to what I would describe as the Ward-Churchill phenomenon. Obviously, higher education does not all encompass the extraordinary egregiousness of Ward-Churchill, nor does it accomplish all of the goals that were established by Cardinal Newman. But it seems to me that we've seen the corruption of higher education in any number of ways. Now let me make a couple of disclaimers. Number one is the personal one. Ann alluded to that, and that is when I first got involved in higher education, I thought that the primary purpose was to play basketball at Columbia, not necessarily to engage in serious study. I went to Columbia with the understanding that I would spend more time in the hardwood than I would in the library. And to some degree that was true, at least at the outset. But there was something that would happen when I was at Columbia back in the 1950s, and it was a great transformation, a transformation in my thinking that I'll get to in a little while. The other thing that I think is very important to note is that I was the first member of my family to go to college. My mom and dad did not have that opportunity. In fact, when I became a dean in the university, I invited my mother to the university faculty club to get an understanding of what university life was like. She got dressed up in her finery, not knowing what university life was like. She walks into the faculty lounge, and everyone there was dressed in T-shirts and jeans. So I introduced my mother to members of the faculty. I say, "Mom, this is Professor Jones." She looks at Professor Jones and she kind of sneers and said, "Professor Jones, can't you afford to wear a suit?" He looked at her oddly and said, "Oh, Mrs. London, this is the way I normally dress. We have a casual style here." Well, when my mother sat down with me, she said, "These people look like unmade beds. Aren't they going to be a model for students? Is this the way in which you want to encourage students? That's the kind of faculty that will be emulated by students in the future?" My mother was onto something. And a day after this event, I actually called up faculty members and I said, "On formal occasions, I think that you should wear a suit and tie. I don't care if you're necessarily wearing the finest suit and tie, but wear a suit and tie. And if you can't afford a jacket, I'll buy the jacket for you." In the case of women and the faculty, I said, "I think you should wear dresses at formal occasions instead of the jeans and T-shirts look." Well, you can imagine the kind of uproar that this caused. There was a note that was sent to the president of the university, and London wants to impose a kind of fashion style for everyone in the academy. Needless to say, this is not what I intended. Although I must say that from my mother to her son to my daughter, Stacy London, who has a program called What Not to Wear, this is in the DNA of the London family. Now, there are, of course, as I think it's very important to note, programs of great importance in the university system, and I don't think that should be overlooked. But it's also true that the university is not what it once was. Charles Eliot, who was president of Harvard University, was asked the question, "Why is there so much intelligence at Harvard?" And he said, "Well, the answer is very simple. The seniors bring so much in, and the freshmen bring so much in, and the seniors take so little out." Now, I would argue that if you're looking at universities today, the freshmen bring almost nothing in, and the seniors take even less out. As a consequence, you don't have the level of intelligence that you once did. Now, obviously, there are exceptions. There are extraordinary programs across the country, what I would regard as the great oases in higher education. Robbie George, my friend at Princeton, has a wonderful program, the Madison program. Di Tommaso has a terrific program at Brown University. My friend Robbie Kuhn has a great program at the University of Texas in Western Civilization. Yes, there are great programs. Harvey Mansfield, of course, has this wonderful program at Harvard. There are terrific programs across the country, and they should not be overlooked. But they are the oases in what has become a cultural wasteland, in my judgment. Now, the other part about this that I want to point out is that Thorstein Veblen in the 1950s made the point that most university students are trained in incapacity. What he meant by that is that they don't know how to do anything when they get out of the university. And by and large, you find this to be true with so many students today. That was the 1950s, by the way. But we ask a student, please describe what you've just seen in a simple sentence. So few are capable of doing that. And I remember having a very interesting experience where I was raising money. It was part of my decanal experience in the university where I had to raise money for my college. And I went to see a fellow named Charles Carlisle, who at that point was the chairman of a company called St. Joe's Minerals, no longer in existence. I think they were bought by the Fluor Corporation. And when I went to see him, I walked into his office and he said, "Why are you here?" And I said, "Sir, I want to tell you a little bit about the college that I've organized at New York University, which is based on the study of great books." He said, "Well, I'm not interested." I said, "Well, I was told by your secretary that you would be interested. Let me explain why I'm here." He said, "Well, you know, you academics, you're so pompous, you're so outrageous." He said, "There's an expression you use that invariably, it seems to suggest something about your pomposity." I said, "I know exactly what you're getting at." He said, "No, you don't." I said, "Sir, I believe with all due respect, I know exactly what phrase you're referring to." He said, "Well, if you can tell me that, I will write a check for your school." I said, "The phrase that you're referring to is "in terms of," which is always used incorrectly, but always used by academics. It is a form of pomposity. He said, "In all the years that I have put people to this test, no one has ever known that." "How did you know that?" I said, "Because in a book called Teacher in America by my mentor and friend, Jacques Barone, he uses that as the pomposity index. People using the expression "in terms of" and using it incorrectly. You can say in terms of X and Y, but you can say in terms of the conditions in American foreign policy. Those are conditions, those are not terms. But that expression is invariably used and used by academics all of the time. He wrote a check for $35,000. At the time, that was an awful lot of money. The first thing I did was call Jacques Barone. And I said, Jacques, you're going to be astonished. But I actually got money because he said, well, that was more money than I ever earned in Teacher in America, the book in which the pomposity index was first used. So it was a very, very interesting experience for me. But it demonstrated a good deal about the inability of students to use the experience in the university for anything that was practical. I also had another curious experience when I was dean. I had visited Japan, and I came across the Kobe University entrance examination. The Kobe University entrance examination included a section on Western civilization, and students were expected to explain the role of Charles Martel, Charlemagne, Joan of Arc, a variety of others, going all the way up to the present, or close to the present, with FDR, Stalin, Churchill. And they had to pass this examination, this portion of the examination, in order to gain entry into Kobe University. So I decided I would give the portion on Western civilization to the students who were entering my college and the university. Well, over the years, I gave that examination to about 10,000 students. Not one passed. Not one. And students had to have pretty decent SAT scores, something in the order of 1350, in order to gain entry into the university and into the college that I headed. And that, to me, demonstrated a good deal about the inability of students to know anything about the civilization in which they reside. Now, what do students learn? And this has been part of the experience. The first thing is that a great emphasis is put on expression. How do you feel about something becomes very critical. When I was at the university, there was an attempt to introduce a feminist studies program. I, by the way, as might surprise you, was an advocate of this program because I said, I can see where students would be reading Sappho, and would be reading Jane Austen, and would be reading George Eliot. And so what I decided to do as a member of this committee, I put down a list of the readings that I think would be appropriate for a program in feminist studies. Well, the chairman of that group repudiated almost everything that I had suggested. She said, our goal here is to talk about male dominance, to express the dissatisfaction that females feel. We're not interested in these readings. This is not important. It's not the substance. It's more the style, the form that's critical. And again, that was a very important lesson for me. A second thing that I discovered is that when the core curriculum was pretty much evaporated by university officials, I went to a dean's meeting on one occasion where it was decided that we needed some course, some sort of introductory course for students who were coming to the university for the first time. And so we introduced a course called Critical Thinking. Now this perplexed me because I always thought that in order to engage in critical thinking, you have to know something. There has to be a knowledge base. You can't engage in critical thinking if you don't know very much. So one day I'm standing in the main building, in the corridor of the main building, and there was a course going on critical thinking. The course had been introduced. And the professor stood up and said to his students, what should we do if we run out of fossil fuels? Now, here were students who never had an introductory course in physics, knew nothing at all about economics, knew nothing at all about how the world works. So first student stands up and says, well, I think we should go to the moon and see if we can engage in taking whatever necessary energy sources there are in the moon. How do you get to the moon if you don't have energy? I was perplexed. And they went from one ignorant comment of that kind to another. It was an exchange of ignorant opinion by and large. And it struck me at the time, if you know nothing about the laws of supply and demand, you know nothing about how price is established, and you know nothing about the conservation of energy, which you would learn in an introductory physics course, and you know nothing at all about chemical principles, how can you engage in a conversation about fossil fuels and the depletion of fossil fuels? It struck me as very odd. But again, the notion that critical thinking is desirable, that obviously is incontrovertible. What is, of course, of great controversy is the idea that you can engage in this kind of critical thinking without having a knowledge base. The third point that I want to make is about self-esteem. We were told that the university graduates that come out of New York University were among the finest in the world. And I went to a commencement exercise in 1971, and the president of the university delivered a major address, 1971. And President Hester, Jim Hester is his name, stood up and he stood before 10,000 people in Washington Square Park, and he said, seated before you are students who are going to solve the problems of war and peace, urban woe, income disparity. I can go on with every empty platitude you can possibly imagine. And at the end of it, I was appalled, absolutely appalled. I happened to run into the president. This was quite coincidental. And he said, "What did you think of my speech, Herb?" I said, "Well, to be perfectly honest, I think it was terrible. You're telling me these students who have never read one book, you can't tell me they've read Plato, because you don't know that. It's not part of the core curriculum. You don't know if they've read the Bible. You don't know if they've read Aristotle. You don't know if they've read Aeschylus. You don't know if they've read Shakespeare. You're going to tell me they're going to solve the problems of urban woe, of income disparity, of war and peace?" I said, "It's ridiculous." So he said, "What would you do?" Well, I said, "Well, at the very least, I'd put together a kind of Matthew Arnoldian program where the best that is known and the best that is thought has been part of the curriculum." Well, that's how my school got founded. He gave me some release time and I created the school. But again, it demonstrates something about the role that university presidents play in engaging in this kind of exaggerated commentary about what students know and what they are capable of doing. The other part about this is the emergence of an orthodoxy. Now, I was not at all familiar with the role of an orthodoxy. I was very much aware of the fact that in the 1950s, almost every faculty member voted for Adlai Stevenson in 1952 and 1956, despite the fact Eisenhower had been the president of Columbia University. And so it was not at all surprising to me that there would be a kind of liberal orientation. But despite the liberal orientation, there was the free exchange of opinion. There was a kind of openness. I was a student of both Mark Van Doren and his son, who many of you know because of the great quiz show. And so I was a student in their classes, and it was quite obvious that they were liberals, but at the same time, they were very much interested in other points of view. And that was very much a part of why I got so excited about university life. I was excited about university life because of this kind of exchange, because of the openness. And as I said, from the hardwood to the library was an easy transition for me because of the people that I had the great pleasure of meeting at Columbia. Samuel Huntington, who later went on to great fame at Harvard, was my advisor at Columbia in those days. And Daniel Bell had his first teaching assignment at Columbia in those days. And I sat in the classroom with Amitei Etzioni. So these people awakened in me a certain kind of thirst for knowledge that I certainly didn't obtain playing basketball. But what has emerged in university life over this 35, 40-year period is something very different. And what's so different about it is what I would describe as the introduction of an orthodoxy, which is a direct reversal of what university life was like in the 1950s. For one thing, let me just give you some illustrations of the orthodoxy as I see it. When first-year students, I can't even say freshmen anymore because that's politically incorrect, but when first-year students attend the university, they come to NYU, and the first thing that is they generally face in an orientation session is a group of homosexual leaders at the academy who say, "We represent the Puerto Rican homosexuals, or the Jewish homosexuals, or the Catholic homosexuals, or the black homosexuals, and we want to raise some questions with you. Are you confused about your sexuality?" Well, many 17, 18-year-olds are confused about their sexuality. Well, come to see us, and we'll help you address that question. I often ask myself, this is very odd. We have every combination and permutation of homosexual on the campus, but there is no heterosexual group that addresses these students. Nor is there an abstinence group that addresses these students. Only one kind of orientation is possible. Now, at the end of the year, each one of these organizations has an opportunity to go to a service award ceremony. At the service award ceremony, the Puerto Rican homosexual leader would stand up and say, "We have 17 recruits." And everyone would applaud, and he gets a service award. And I've asked myself, there's something very odd about this, that what we are doing is recruiting for homosexuality. Now, I'm not here to present a picture of homosexuality or anti-homosexuality, but the point is that in university life, this is what is acceptable. This is what is politically correct. Another one of the conditions that emerges is this notion of relativism, that truth cannot be known, that truth is something that is elusive, that in fact we cannot possibly understand what it is. Now, it's true that truth in some circumstances is very elusive and it's difficult to obtain. But there are some truths. When the ministers, I call them ministers, of the social text, which was a very important publication at NYU, would come to my 9th floor office, and we would engage in discussions about semiotics, an odd discipline based on the idea that truth is unknown. I would always say after they would leave my office, "You know something, gentlemen, why don't we leave from the window rather than from the elevator?" They'd say, "Herb, what are you getting at?" Well, I said, "Well, if there's no truth, let's test the laws of gravity and see whether, in fact, you'd be willing to leave from the window." They never took me up on that suggestion. Now that is one of the problems. The other issue, very much related to relativism, is what I would call the issue of subjectivity. Now, in the academy, there used to be journalism programs. Certainly they've existed for 50 years. But the journalism programs always started with the assumption is that if you want to describe something, try to describe it without using adjectives. Don't put yourself into the story. That is, if you're going to describe a fire, was it a 4-alarm, was it a 3-alarm fire, how many people were in the building, was the fire on the 4th floor or the 5th floor, try to describe it as objectively as you can. Now that tables have turned dramatically. You even see this on the front page of the New York Times where the first person is employed in a news story. How do I, as the journalist, feel about the fire? Do I feel that people are suffering from tremendous anguish? What did I see as I looked into the building? What adjectives can I employ to describe my feelings, my sentiment about it? So that the objective story is less important than the story that is written by the editorialist or by the journalist. That is a very significant change. It becomes a significant change not only in the way in which journalism is conducted, but the way in which the university conducts its affairs as well. And then the last point I would make about the orthodoxy, and perhaps I can even cite one person here, is Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn wrote a textbook, People's History of the United States, which is the most popular textbook in American history, and certainly over the last 30 years, the best-selling American history textbook that we've known. This textbook, by the way, also led to a very important film. A Good Will Hunting, I guess was the name of the film. Ben Affleck won the Academy Award for the script, a script based largely on Howard Zinn's book. Now, the Howard Zinn book is an anti-American book. What it deals with is the whole idea that there's always this contention, this conflict in American life. Zinn, as we now know, is a communist in the 1920s and 30s, has passed this mortal coil. But the interesting thing about it is that the book has had a profound effect on a whole generation of Americans. But it's not American studies that you study with Howard Zinn's book, it's anti-American studies. And yet this has become a very prominent part of the general landscape in higher education. Now, how do you defend this kind of orthodoxy? Now, if what I've suggested is true, or even partially true, we see these challenge to bourgeois values, we see relativism, we see subjectivity, we see anti-Americanism, how do you defend it? Well, the first and most significant defense is what I would describe as the new version of academic freedom. And I say new version very intentionally. The old version of academic freedom was based on a 1947 commentary that was made by the AAUP, in which the AAUP said at that time, the academic is free to engage in discussion of ideas in an area in which he has competence. He is not free to express himself on any subject. He is not given the rule of authority simply because he wants to express views. That's the kind of liberty that you have with free speech. In other words, someone can stand in front of this building, get on a soapbox and say, I believe in flat earth theory. I may think the guy is a crackpot, but at the same time I say that comes under the general category of free speech. But I would not give that same man a position in the university in an earth science program, because we assume that in earth science, if you're going to discuss flat earth, you know that the earth is not flat. You're also aware of the fact that there's a certain level of competence in which you can express your views. Sidney Hook once, I think, put it very, very well. He talked about the German gymnasium, and he said there are two elements associated with academic freedom. One is Lehrfreiheit, which is based on the idea that you're free to learn in an environment where you will not be intimidated. When the professor at Columbia, Professor Massoud, said to a student who served in the Israeli Defense Force, how many Arab women and children have you killed? He violated academic freedom. The second part of academic freedom is Lehrfreiheit, which is based on the idea in the gymnasium that you are free as a professor to express your views in an area where you have demonstrated competence. When the students at Dartmouth Review went through a class in music at Dartmouth College that was organized principally around the issue of race, not music, and they described the course at Pots and Pans, the president of the university said these students were irreverent. Well, they weren't irreverent. They were accurate. They were accurate in describing a course that was described as music in the catalog, but dealt not with music, but rather with a diatribe on race in America. Now, it seems to me that a professor should be free to describe and express himself in areas where he knows something. But if he's going to engage in a discussion unrelated to the topic at hand, he is no longer covered by all of the authority associated with academic freedom. So the way in which we describe academic freedom today is a latitudinarian version of academic freedom. It has nothing at all to do with academic freedom as it was originally understood in either the German gymnasium or in the way in which the AAUP originally described academic freedom. The second way in which the orthodoxy is retained is the tenure system. Now, what has happened with the tenure system, which is also very interesting, is that people who have tenure sit as a tenure committee in deciding whether, in fact, a new faculty member who has served 7 years in the academy deserves to receive tenure. Tenure is, in fact, a lifetime position. And despite the fact I had great admiration for Senator Moynihan, one of the great mistakes I believe Senator Moynihan made was when he said that no professor in the United States can be involuntarily unemployed. I think that was an error. I think there should be a time limit, largely because you need ventilation in the academy. You need new voices in the academy. Someone reading from the same yellowing notes after 50 years in the academy doesn't strike me as the kind of person you want there. Nonetheless, and there are, by the way, exceptions to that rule, but nonetheless, I do feel that the tenure system should not be used for political purposes. And I found myself in an odd situation where I invited a faculty member to teach in the Gallatin school that I headed, who was somewhat conservative in her outlook. She taught very well. She wrote very well. She published several books. She was a truly outstanding scholar in my mind, and her colleagues felt very much the same way. But when it came to the tenure decision, she was rejected by members of her peer group, in part because they felt she didn't meet the political standard that they thought was appropriate. That was, she was an avowed conservative. An avowed conservative, in their minds, did not belong in the academy, certainly did not deserve tenure. And so a political judgment was made, not a judgment about her academic talents, but a judgment about her politics. That is not as unusual as you might assume, and is one of the things that concerns me a great deal. Now, one might ask, what was the turning point? How did this all occur? What was the evolution of these events? Well, obviously, the anti-Vietnam episode in American history was part of it. There were teach-ins during that period that I remember very well, from roughly 1967 to 1972. And almost every spring was a kind of bacchanalian delight, where you didn't hold classes. Spring became a kind of extended vacation for faculty members. But the most interesting part of it is that the university was complicit in promoting a point of view, an anti-Vietnam point of view. The teach-ins never included those who believed that the war was justifiable. Now, whether you thought the war was justifiable or not, you would think in the interest of fairness that there would be a debate about this issue. No, the teach-in had only one goal in mind, and that was to challenge the government's stance on Vietnam. Now, the student radicals of the late 1960s and early 70s, to a great extent, became the professors of the future. And they understood something that most people in the academy did not. That is this softness in the academy, the fact that you can push through in the academy a way of change that no one could have anticipated back in the 1950s. In 1968, when there were the riots at Columbia, and what was obviously a very telling event, it was quite interesting to me that the students who were involved in this understood something that the faculty members did not. That is, that the faculty members were pusillanimous. They were unwilling to stand up to these students. They were unwilling to tell them what was right and wrong. Students walked into the president's office, took over that office, trashed the office, smoked his cigars, did everything that you could possibly imagine, put markings on the walls. And yet the faculty members refused to in any way challenge the students. When the president finally called the police, he was criticized by members of the Columbia faculty. It represented the great change in higher education, where there was the belief that the students had a better understanding of the academy than the faculty members, and by and large there was some truth to that claim, because the faculty members were so cowardly in the face of the challenges that then existed. So it was clear you could march through this institution and take it over. Why did the radicals end up in the academy? Because they knew full well the old Gramscian idea, you can march through this institution and take it over. You may remember Antonio Gramsci was the founder of the Italian Communist Party in 1921. When he founded the party with Togliatti, they had one very simple idea in mind. It was 1921, it was 4 years after the Russian Revolution, and they asked the obvious question, why isn't there an Italian revolution? I mean, they're Marxists, and they believed that the revolution was inevitable. And they said, well, in thinking about it, there are two reasons. One is the Catholic Church, the role that the church plays, and two was the belief in patriotism, since Italy was a recent state, and obviously the sense of nationalism was well established. So these were the two factors. And what did Gramsci say? We must march through the institutions and destroy the influence of the Catholic Church and the influence of nationalism and patriotism. And this is precisely what happened, not only with Gramsci, but then you look at the DNA, Gramsci, the Frankfurt School, Saul Alinsky, and the present. And this is what you have. This is what you have in the academy. We've marched through the academy, the orthodoxy is ensconced, and it is an orthodoxy that challenges the very basis of Western civilization. Now, let me move on to one other point. In 1969, I was walking down the streets of New York University, near University Place and Waverly Place, and there was graffito on the wall. And the graffito said, "Make them teach you only what you want to learn." That, for me, was kind of emblazoned in my mind. Make them teach you only what you want to learn. Now, the presumption behind the academy is that people like me, who were absolute innocents, wanted to play basketball, knew nothing at all about academic life, and it was the inspiration that was provided by the faculty members that changed my life. Now I'm told, no, it's the students that are the center of attention. The faculty members are irrelevant. They are maybe guides on the side, but they are no longer the center of attention. So that the academy itself has changed. It's something like the Wizard of Oz philosophy. By the power vested in me, I'm going to make you all intelligent by giving you degrees. And now we have the same sort of philosophy that is now encountered by students who are saying, we're going to tell you what we want to learn. We're going to tell you how we should be graded. And so how do you want to be graded if you're a student in this new era? Undifferentiated grades. After all, why should we be in a competitive environment? And so it's not A, B, C, D, F. It's now A and B. In fact, when I became dean in 1972, and I looked at the dean's list, and there was a dean's list, I said, this is absurd. This is the roster of students who are in the program. If I want to know who's in the program, I can read the roster. I don't have to read the dean's list. So the first thing I did was to eliminate the dean's list. Needless to say, this didn't cause great satisfaction with either students or faculty members, but it struck me that it was important to do that because we no longer had a qualitative standard for evaluating students. Now, I presented a long-winded description of what I think is the problem with higher education. But Anne, I think, also said something very important. And it's not merely a question of what we can criticize, but what we can save. And there's so much about the academy that is worth saving. It is an institution that can have a profound effect on one's life. Now, one of the things that I think is very unusual is the extent to which technology can have a profound effect on the way in which we think about higher education. Now, my friend Ken Minogue challenged me when I wrote a piece about the role that technology can play because he said the same garbage that you're getting at the moment can simply be transferred over to a technological system that now can disseminate it more widely. He's got a point. But the interesting point is that technology also provides you with a variety of ways in which you can transmit knowledge. The DVD, the computer system, the internet, all of them very valuable devices in the transmission of information. The online university provides us with an opportunity to now engage in not simply the conventional teaching method, but a method that involves your availability, not simply the time when you have to be in a class from 9 to 11. It involves a change in the way in which we think about higher education. And there are illustrations, and some very good illustrations, of online education. There are a lot of bad ones as well. But Yorktown University is one such example which I think demonstrates that online education can be very effective. The other thing that I think is interesting is because of the financial pressures that now exist in higher education, we are seeing a demise of tenure. Tenure is soon to be eliminated. There will be multi-year contracts, but there will not be tenure. In my judgment, this is very desirable. Now, I understand all of the arguments on behalf of tenure. That is, it gives faculty members a certain kind of freedom in which they can display their academic freedom. But at the same time, as I indicated, tenure is being abused in a variety of ways. And it's also being abused to promote a certain kind of political philosophy that I think is very dangerous. There is an awakening that's occurring with a new generation of students. A lot of it has to do with some of the books that Anne made reference to before, but perhaps the most important of the books that has been published in the last 30 years was Alan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind, which I think was the best-selling book of a whole era. In fact, on one occasion, I had lunch with Alan Bloom in the Chicago Club, and he was very, very perplexed And Alan used to smoke, take a long puff on a cigarette. There'd be the pregnant pause, and he'd say, Herb, how do you explain this? I don't understand this. The last half of the book deals with the Nietzscheanization of America. Who would read this book? And now millions of copies have been sold. I said, Alan, with all due respect, I have a hypothesis about this. He said, well, what is that? I said, well, you have youngsters who go to a university, they come home and they tell their parents they're bourgeois pigs. They don't understand the polity in which they reside. They have no understanding of their own basic homophobic and racist attitudes. They are completely unaware of non-Western civilizations. And the parents, thoroughly perplexed by the attitude of their youngsters, are willing to invest $25 in your book to understand why they're squandering $25,000 a year on their education. He didn't use the word squandering, by the way. But he looked at me and he said, aha, I think that's right. I think that's right. And indeed, I think it's right. I believe that, because there is no question that what we have seen is a great change on parents and trustees and alumni of the kind of people that Anne represents, who have come to the realization that there's something deeply wrong with higher education and we've got to change it. Attitudes in America are critical, and to some degree, they are very often implanted in students who are attending our colleges and universities. I have one last experience that I want to talk about, or two experiences that I want to talk about before I bring this to an end. My daughter, youngest daughter, went to Northwestern. She graduated a year ago. When she was at Northwestern, she was in a class in political theory. And the class had fairly classic readings in Aristotle's Politics and Machiavelli and Plato, and it was a perfectly acceptable program. I had no problem with it. I had no problem with the readings and no problem with the assignments. However, the large lecture class was broken up into recitation sessions of roughly 15, 20 students each. And at one of these recitation sessions, my daughter is in a class with roughly 15 other students, and the instructor walks in the first class. She says, one of the things that you should understand about America is America is basically a caste system. There aren't opportunities to get ahead. Okay? Class number 2, America is basically a racist society where members of the black and brown races cannot gain any advantage. Class number 3 was a class on homophobia, that America is basically a homophobic society. So in class number 4, my daughter, who is usually very, very careful about expressing herself in these classes, couldn't take it anymore, and she said to the instructor, you've provided no evidence for these claims. So what evidence, what readings are you counting on? I mean, it would be very helpful if you can provide us with some guidance. Professor looked at her and said, Jacqueline, perhaps you will tell us what your political affiliation is. My daughter was perplexed. She says, well, what bearing does that have on my question? I just want to know what I ought to read. What is the evidence for the claims that you're making? She said, well, are you afraid to tell us what your political affiliation is? So my daughter said, well, I'm a Republican. She said, oh, I would have guessed that, Jacqueline. You don't have to attend this class anymore. You'll find it quite unacceptable. Now, my daughter, I was in San Francisco at the time giving a speech. My daughter left the class that day, called me, quite alarmed, on my cell phone. And I said, look, let me look into this matter. What I'd like you to do, first thing I'd like you to do is to write down everything that transpired. And then the second thing that I'd like you to do is I'd like you to send it to the chairman of the politics department. And then what I'd like you to do is to send it to the alternative newspaper, which happened to be a conservative newspaper on campus, which he did. And to my astonishment, mirabile dictu, she was fired. This young lady was fired. And I was very happy about that. Not because I am eager to bring about changes that would be consistent with my own philosophical views, but because that is an inappropriate way to conduct a class. One student shouldn't be inhibited in that fashion, they shouldn't be intimidated in that fashion, and they should not be subject to any kind of political litmus test. Now, the last story I want to mention is a story in which involves some university presidents. I was asked to address university presidents on the state of the academy, not unlike the presentation that I've made here this afternoon. And in the course of that presentation, I asked these presidents, 7 presidents, what do you consider to be the overarching issue that you are now confronting in the academy? Every single one, without exception, said, finding the funds that are necessary to continue the university mission. That was the statement. And I said to myself, but what if the mission is unacceptable? What if the mission involves a kind of proselytizing that is distinctly inappropriate for the academy. What if the mission is not what the mission ought to be? None of them were willing to accept that. They were willing to concede that there is, in fact, some problems associated with the politicization of the campus, but they were unwilling to concede that that is the most significant problem. Now that reminds me of a story, and again I ought to end on this note. It's a story involving Mr. Zimmerman, who owns a furniture store. Mr. Zimmerman walks into his furniture store one day, and there to his astonishment is his wife in a compromising position with his leading salesman on the couch. He is very disturbed, needless to say. He walks out of the store, walks out of the furniture store, and goes to see his rabbi. And he says to Rabbi, there was my wife in the furniture store in this compromising position with my leading salesman on a couch. The rabbi says, well, sir, I think you have two options. One, you can fire your salesman. He said, fire my salesman? 80% of my business is due to the extraordinary efforts of Mr. Zweig. I can't fire my salesman. He said, well, you might consider leaving your wife. Leaving my wife? Don't be absurd. My wife, I think, has been quite loyal for the 30 years we've been married. I regard this act as aberrational. She is the mother of my 3 children. Under no circumstances can I consider leaving my wife. Rabbi said, well, I don't know what else to suggest, sir. Well, a couple of weeks pass. Mr. Zimmerman is walking down the street. He runs into the rabbi. Mr. Zimmerman has a big smile on his face. So the rabbi says, well, Mr. Zimmerman, I guess you've decided to make a decision. He said, indeed I have. He said, well, are you going to fire Mr. Zweig? Oh, no, don't be silly. I told you under no circumstances could I fire Mr. Zweig. He said, well, and I assume that what you've decided to do is you're going to separate from your wife. He said, don't be ridiculous. I told you that's not going to happen. He said, well, why are you smiling? He said, I'm smiling because I sold the couch. Now, the reason why I tell you that story is because the couch is the issue that university presidents are confronting. They're unwilling to confront the serious problems that we have in higher education and the ones that should be addressed. The problems that Ann talked about right at the outset and that I've tried to insinuate into my remarks. The problems of the curriculum, or what should students know. The problems of why we're in the academy in the first place. That is, why are we here on earth? What are the central issues that we should be discussing in the humanities and in the soft sciences? There is the question of whether, in fact, the academy should be based on the idea that proselytizing is desirable. After all, the academy is not a church. We're there to learn, not necessarily to preach. There's the other factor that I mentioned earlier, and that is the way in which the orthodoxy has taken hold and the extent to which an orthodoxy stands in the way of genuine learning. And then there is the other point that while we put an emphasis on self-esteem and learning as much or thinking as much about yourself as possible, we overlook the fact that the only way in which you can engage in critical thinking, or any kind of thinking, is to have a knowledge base that allows you to engage in a systematic examination of the facts. With that, I bring this to a close, and thank you so much for your attention. Now, this is your opportunity to ask a question, and what I would very much like you to do, if you wouldn't mind, is to answer a question with the microphone that is being passed around. And the only way you're going to appear on C-SPAN is if you talk into the microphone. So please do that. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Dinah Furch-Scott-Ruth, and I'm a senior fellow here at the Hudson Institute. Thank you very much for that wonderful talk. I was wondering if you had any advice to any students who are at the academy and who are confronted with these professors who only give them A's if they write in a certain way. You gave the example of your daughter, Jacqueline. You gave her very good advice. She wrote a letter to the chairman of the department, to the newspaper. Is that the course that you would advise to other students? Because there seems to be pressure for conformity. In other words, if you say something like, and I've given many lectures on campuses, that men and women are biologically different and that many women prefer to have flexible jobs because they like to spend more time with their children. They look at me as though I'm crazy. And I've written several books on the subject. So you can find this pressure to conform among the students. What can these students do?
Well, Diana, I think it's an interesting question, and there's not one answer, but let me give you several answers, if I may. Number one, Diana Fishkov-Roth writes brilliantly about higher education and the role that higher education can play in its relationship to employment opportunities. So if you haven't seen her work, you ought to take a look at it. And there's someone else here today, Amy Cass, who I think was here today, who not only has written about higher education and put an anthology together on higher education, but Amy has won every academic award the University of Chicago can confer. And then there's my colleague, John Walters, who has put together a program through the Herzog Foundation dealing with the whole question of higher education and what students should know. Now, let me attempt to answer your question. It seems to me that you ought to say to students who are in the academy today, this is an exploration. You can navigate your way through the academy if you will talk to one professor in whom you have confidence about the nature of the academy and what can come out of it. I had that conversation with Jacques Barone in the late 1950s. Jacques became a friend, but he was a mentor. And I entered that seminar, the very, very famous Trilling Barson seminar at Columbia. And I must say that it was an awakening for me. And if you can have one kind of experience, just one experience of that kind, then the 4 years are worthwhile. So I would urge students to engage in this kind of exploration. Find a faculty member that you have some confidence in, talk to that person about how you navigate your way through the academy, and then try and find the 2 or 3 professors in the academy that you can work with very closely. And I'm not talking about liberal and conservative here, by the way. I had another experience that was very interesting for me and very, very informative. I was the research assistant for C. Wright Mills. C. Wright Mills was writing a book about, as you might remember, the Cuban experience. He's very pro-Castro, and he wrote a book called Listen, Yankee. And one of the areas of research that I was engaged in was on the United Fruit Company. And one of the things that I found was that the United Fruit Company was not as bad as C. Wright Mills was suggesting. In fact, by and large, its efforts were quite salutary in Latin America. And when I brought this to C. Wright Mills' attention, he looked at me, and with just a gesture, he said, "Don't bother me." He wasn't interested in the evidence because he was writing a polemic. So the evidence was irrelevant. But for me, that was a wonderful learning experience. I learned here's a well-known professor writing a book, and he wants to write a polemic. He wasn't interested in the evidence. That was a great learning experience. So you can learn from the other side as well, from the people who are doing the wrong things as well as the people who are doing the right things. And it's always a question of thinking about the university as a kind of this phantasmagoria, a smorgasbord. And you can draw from it the important things that you think are critical, the things that you think could make a difference. And so I think that you have to be as careful as possible in the selection. Now, one of the things that's happened with the elimination of the core curriculum, which I think is disastrous, is that nonetheless you have this tremendous smorgasbord out there. The core curriculum, so-called core curriculum, is nothing but a Chinese menu. Select 8 number from column A, 10 from column B, 6 from column C. That's what the core curriculum has become. At the University of Pennsylvania, the core curriculum is almost 450 pages. At Princeton University, it's something on the order of 350 pages. I looked at the Princeton University core curriculum in 1897. It was 6 pages. So they knew exactly what they wanted students to study. One of the problems now is you have a lot of invented disciplines. It's not only a question of reading Shakespeare. Shakespeare might be the title. Now the question is, was Shakespeare gay? Or queer studies in Shakespeare? Or did Shakespeare have some sort of odd relationship with Gertrude? I mean, was Gertrude a surrogate mother? I mean, these are the kinds of questions that are addressed, which make the curriculum very odd indeed. But the problem, of course, is how does a 17-year-old decide? And it's not easy. That's one of the reasons why look at the guides, find that guide in the academy, and use that person to navigate your way through this 4-year period. Yes, sir. Please use the microphone.
Al Milliken, AM Media. What do you know about the state of international universities outside the United States, and what comparisons would you make? Particularly those, I guess, that would be generally considered the best.
Well, let me make a point about this. I had the opportunity to attend Cambridge University, Mary Magdalene College, years ago, and it was a wonderful experience, and it was great getting outside of the United States. And also, what you find is that, by and large, American universities are rate busters compared to those abroad. Abroad, you are very much on your own. British students, or at least in the British Academy, you can go sailing all day. They give you a reading list, do the readings, and at some point you're going to be tested. But you're pretty much on your own. So it's very, very different from the American system, where there's a lot of hand-holding, a lot of classes that you have to take, a different kind of educational atmosphere. The other thing that's true is because most institutions abroad regard you as autodidacts. In the United States, you don't have the kind of self-learning that you have elsewhere. When the British Open University attempted to open in the United States, it was a terrible failure. And the reason for it is because the culture in England is, here's a study, go out and study it. I mean, here's a guide, read it, understand it, you'll learn the course. In the United States, you're expected to be in a classroom, there's an exchange of opinion, a professor stands in front of the room, you are guided, there's hand-holding. So that's one very significant difference. In a world where we're now increasingly told that there are links between the United States and all nations around the globe, every American university now has portals elsewhere. NYU in Abu Dhabi, Harvard in China, all over Japan, there are American universities. So now we are seeing the linkages occur. Now the question is, are American universities influencing these universities abroad, or are they influencing American universities? The answer is not clear yet. Having an experience abroad is, I think, very useful. But I remember the old George Bernard Shaw line, you can take an ass around the world and it doesn't become a horse. Simply because you've studied abroad doesn't mean you're going to be any smarter. So it's important to understand that, because you've studied in another university, has nothing at all to do with how intelligent you will be. But I think that sometimes the university experience outside the United States can be very helpful. But it largely depends on where, under what circumstances, and an awful lot about the student.
If I can just add there as well, I mean, certainly, as Herb has said, NYU is certainly working vigorously to have its Abu Dhabi campus, and I think we are seeing some international campuses develop. I do think it raises some fairly interesting, significant questions about academic freedom. Some of these countries in which these universities are being established have far more restrictive attitudes in terms of what students can do and say, and I think that as American universities become involved abroad, they need to be keenly aware of whether or not academic freedom, which in its finest is the essence of rich education, whether or not that is being trammeled in any way because of their location in foreign countries.
Anne raises a very interesting point about the University NYU program in Abu Dhabi, where in fact if you're holding an Israeli passport, you're going to have some problems gaining entry into Abu Dhabi. And so that does raise some issues about academic freedom, as she suggested, and I think it's a very important point. Michael, why don't you get the microphone?
What about the role of trustees in this mix, Herb?
Anne is probably in a much better position to answer this question than I am, but I'll start anyway. One of the reasons why you have trustees in the university is the expectation that they're going to provide money or prestige. That's why they're there. It also is a way for many individuals to, I think, play a role in academic life. But by and large, over the history of the academy, and you can find this in Hofstadter's history of the college or Metzger's history on the university, the trustees were there as a rubber stamp. That's starting to change. It changed at Dartmouth College, where there was a vote on outside trustees. It has changed because of Anne's extraordinary efforts in alerting trustees to the role that they can play in the academy. You're starting to see trustees who are far more assertive, and in my judgment, this is a very healthy development. And Anne, I know that she's worked very hard with trustees all over the country. So as I said, she's in a much better position to answer this question. It's also very much related not only to trustees, but to alumni members as well, who take pride in the fact that if you look at the U.S. News and World Report on the status of institutions and your college happens to be in the top 25, you say, isn't that wonderful? But what does that mean precisely? No one really knows. Anne.
Yeah, if I can leap in here, I think the richness of American higher education has largely been because it is uniquely reliant on lay trustees. Unlike other higher education systems, we have over the years in our public system relied on individuals largely appointed by governors, although it varies from state to state. And so that they bring a broader lay perspective to what happens in our colleges and universities and provide a tie to those universities and what's happening in the civic life of our country. I think this is, again, one of the greatest aspects and unique aspects of American higher education. Herb is certainly right that over the years, for better or for worse, trustees have been viewed as ATM machines, hand over your money, no questions asked. And I think one of the roles of the American Council of Trustees and Alumni has been to empower and educate and inform trustees so that rather than being rubber stamps, rather than simply relying on information solely from the administration, that they start to ask the kinds of questions that go to issues of academic excellence, academic freedom, and accountability. I think Herb is right that we are seeing increasingly, and ACTA is working very hard to do this, more engaged trustees who are asking questions. If you ask internal constituencies on a college campus who's in charge here, the faculty will invariably say, we are. And I think that's absolutely right when it comes to what goes on in the classroom, when it comes to determining a syllabus and what is being read. That is rightly the responsibility of faculty. But unfortunately, in many respects, that has been transformed into telling trustees that they have to remain hands-off when it comes to what happens in the curriculum. And one of the lessons that we are imparting to trustees is that as fiduciaries, they are responsible not only for the financial well-being, but also for the academic well-being. And that means assessing what it is graduates of their institutions will know and attempting to direct those students to what they need for success after graduation. That's why we're so engaged and interested in what's happening in the core curriculum and in general education, where largely faculty have been allowed to teach whatever they would like to teach as opposed to what students need to learn. And so that's one area where we think trustees can and should be much more active than they've been in the past. And there are examples already where they have been actively engaged and positively so.
If you do not have access to Anne's work, please go to your computers today and take a look at ACTA online. I mean, it's an extraordinary organization, and she, as I indicated before, and I'm not exaggerating, has been an absolute dynamo in promoting the idea that alumni members and trustees should play an active role in the academy. Yes, sir. Would you wait for the microphone?
Will Amatruda. Two comments, each leading to a question. First, you've described a number of horror stories, but not the way in which abuses create a reaction and a pushback which often limits the damage. And I'm thinking of Bernstein's book, Dictatorship of Virtue, which has quite a few case studies, although one of them involves the high school. And I would invite you to comment on the book and what you think of it, if you're familiar with it, as I gather you are. Second, with regard to Howard Zinn, I would certainly agree it's a very tendentious book. And there was a very good review / put down of it a number of years ago in Dissent magazine. But what I would ask is, has anyone looked into how many places, or whether there are any places where Zinn is used as the textbook in American history, as opposed to a supplementary reading? And with the specific example of Andrew Jackson, the only thing Zinn says about Jackson is the Trail of Tears. Right. Nothing about the Bank of the United States. Which clearly does not give you a full picture of Jackson's significance in American history. But by the same token, the kind of celebratory history which would have ignored the Trail of Tears is also a distortion. Well,
first of all, I'm not here to advocate a celebratory history. I would be arguing for an accurate history, and that includes both the imperfections as well as the challenges and achievements. It's important, I think, for American students to understand both. The reason why I brought up the Zinn book and what I describe as anti-American studies is because the Howard Zinn book sold more than 25 million copies, was the most widely sold American history text in the United States, used at both the high school and college level. Was it adopted at the state level? In a couple of states it was adopted at the state level. Now, the important point about this is not so much Howard Zinn, but the fact that there is not a history textbook in the United States that has sold anywhere near that number, anywhere close to it, and that has served as a counterweight to the influence that Howard Zinn has had on the study of American thought. The second point that I would raise with you, which is an interesting one, the Bernstein book I think is fascinating. And I think that he does make an awful lot about the pushback that occurs in the academy, and it can occur. But there is also a degree of unanimity that has occurred that it's astonishing. By dint of my decanal experience at NYU, I was in the University Senate. Almost every vote that we had at the University Senate was 77-1. I was the one. I would always say at that point, Mr. President, I wonder if we can have a roll call vote so I can express my displeasure than simply having a voice vote. What you have is the herd of independent thinkers in the academy. And by and large, what you have is a unanimity of opinion. And a lot of it is really nonsensical. I remember having an office very close to the well-known philosopher and thinker Derrida. And Derrida used to walk around talking about ergality, parergality. I had no idea what he was talking about. I thought it was all just nonsense. But the interesting thing about it is that when he would lecture to a class, he would say, you know something, I believe in a kind of democratic ethos. But on the other hand, he would stand in front of the room and say, I possess the Rosetta Stone for your understanding about the English language and about almost everything. And if you listen to me and adopt what I'm saying and speak in the language that I'm giving you, you too will possess that Rosetta Stone. So students, of course, were enchanted. After all, here's the key to learning, right up in front of the room. It was anything but democratic. And it had nothing at all to do with anything that I understood. And it certainly had very, very little to do with any understanding of rational behavior. But it was a kind of post-constructionist view. And by and large, people bought into it. Now, I used to say to my colleagues in the academy, this is silly, this is nonsense. This emperor is not wearing any clothes. They would say, oh, no, this is beyond anything you can understand. This is beyond anything that you can consider to be appropriate. I mean, this is so outstanding, it was silliness. And now there are a lot of people who come to the conclusion that a lot of this postmodern language and this postmodern business was pure nonsense. And yet there were very few people in the academy who were willing to say so. And the last point I would make about this is that on one occasion in one of my Senate meetings where I stood up and opposed the stance that was taken, it was largely over the issue of whether the Navy could recruit on campus. And we had a vote, and it was 77-1, that the Navy should not be permitted to recruit on campus because of its avowed stance against homosexuals. And I was the one who objected, saying we have to have an open campus. We should not rule out the Navy. The Navy should be permitted on our campus. I got a handwritten note from a faculty member, and I couldn't read it. It was almost illegible. It was written in such tiny script. So I called up this fellow, who, by the way, was one of the people who worked on the atomic bomb project, who was the chairman of the physics department at that point, who was the chairman of the American Physics Association, who was about as prominent as a professor as you would find in the academy. And I said to him, Ben, I do not understand. Why did you send me this note that I can barely read? Why don't you have it typed? In those days we used a typewriter. Or have your secretary type it. He said, I didn't want anyone to know that I agreed with your position at the Senate meeting. So this is what I mean by the unanimity of thought that accompanied this post-Vietnam era in what happened in the academy. Well, I think Bernstein makes a very interesting point. There was very little in the way of pushback, at least in the 35 years that I've been associated with the academy. Yes, sir.
J.P. Furr with the Washington Examiner. I was wondering if you could speak to the gross expansion of the bureaucracy as well in the university. I mean, Cornell is typically called Big Red, not because it's communist, but just because it's the Big Red. But now it's called Big Red Tape because of all the things you have to go through. So.
JD, I think that's a very important point, and we've seen these mandates that have been passed down. And what you have is the expansion of administrative authority within the academy in large part to deal with these mandates. And so you have all of these new people on the academy, the affirmative action director, all kinds of people who have been passed down from federal legislation to actual positions in the academy. It's increased expenses dramatically, and it's changed the character of the university. When Jacques Barone wrote a very interesting book called The American University, published in 1967, he talked about this as the great danger of the future. He didn't get into the politicization question because it really hadn't occurred. 1968 was just over the horizon, but not before the book was published. And so he said this was the real problem, the insinuated role of the federal government into university life. And now it's a part of university life, and you have all of these positions that are designed to satisfy someone in the federal government. And that's a problem. It adds to the expense of the academy, and it, of course, limits the kind of authority that people have over their own affairs.
Could you be specific about those positions? I don't know what
Well, I mentioned one, the affirmative action director, that comes directly from this. There are also all these grants that are given to the universities through the federal government. And so you have a grants director in the academy, a position that was relatively unknown 30, 40 years ago. You have people who are there to deal with legal matters that are now very much a part of the academy that have been brought down. So you have to have at least 3 or 4 people who are part of the legal council dealing with legal matters generally involving the federal government. And so, I mean, these are just a few of the positions. I can't at this moment give you an accounting of all of the others, but there are many others that fall into this general category. It becomes a very expensive proposition. Speaking, by the way, of the legal matter, and this was a point that I neglected to make, but it's a very interesting one. There was a point in 1969, 1970, where the law school at NYU in moot court had this question that was addressed in moot court: should homosexuals be permitted to adopt? That was the question in moot court. And students, of course, had the opportunity to argue on both sides, and in fact were obliged to, not simply had the opportunity, they were obliged to. So even if you disagreed with the proposition, you had to argue in favor of it, because that's part of moot court. It was part of the experience. Anyone who's been through law school understands what are the prerequisites associated with moot court. Well, in this particular instance, the students went out and demonstrated against moot court, saying we don't even want to consider this proposition, which was very, very interesting, because presumably things that you may consider to be undesirable or even unfamiliar or even things that you would normally oppose are considered in moot court, and you have to consider both sides, and you are obliged to argue even positions that you would not necessarily hold. That was not permitted in that particular case. And the university ultimately relented and said to the students, okay, we will not ask this question, which for me was another one of these capitulations that I thought was so significant during that period.
If I can leap in, I do think that the point you raise is a very, very serious one in terms of the massive increase in the number of administrators that we're seeing. Certainly there are more administrators now being added than there are faculty members. And I think this gets, again, to the bigger issue of the cost. I mean, you have parents who are paying through the teeth for colleges and universities, and you would at least think that they were paying for education. But in fact, universities are focusing on these massive bureaucracies, student life bureaucracies as an example. In the past, faculty could be counted on to do advising and to engage with students. Now we have non-trained student life bureaucracies, often which engage in nothing short of indoctrination on college campuses. These are trends, I think, that are deeply troubling, and the American Council of Trustees and Alumni actually has started a series of report cards, and one of the things that we do is we analyze the costs at institutions, and we look to see whether or not they're spending more on administration or more on instruction. And when they are spending more on administration, they get a bad grade, as we think they rightfully should. We see lots of stories about high salaries of presidents, any number of issues, all of which are going to dollars that take away from the educational experience of the students. And I think it's one of the dirty little stories of higher ed today.
Ann raises, I think, a very important point about the cost in higher education, and I think she's absolutely correct. What people do not realize and sometimes overlook is that the cost is usually equated with quality. And so when I remember we used to have a conversation, perhaps the most significant conversation that deans engaged in, about the tuition increase for the following year. And invariably what trumped all other considerations was what Yale was going to introduce in the way of a tuition increase. Why? Because we wanted to be the Yale on the square. So if Yale was saying it's a 5% increase, then we entertained the idea of a 5% increase. I used to raise the question about elasticity. Does this affect demand? This was all considered irrelevant. What was really relevant is that if you charge a higher price, this is like the Gucci effect. You charge for a Gucci scarf, people think it's a better scarf because it has the word Gucci on it. If you have a higher tuition, people think this is a more desirable institution. Bennington had the highest tuition in the United States, and I remember a parent once saying to me, "Oh, isn't it wonderful that Bennington has the highest tuition in the United States? It must be the best institution in the United States." Well, it doesn't quite work that way, but that was an assumption that was very often made. One other interesting point about this, and what I consider to be the odd economics in higher education. We had a serious problem with space in the academy, particularly at the 6 o'clock hour in the main building. And what very often happened is there were a lot of students who would work during the day. As a consequence, many wanted the 6 o'clock class from 6 to 8. And so the classrooms were in great demand during that hour. And the way in which the university officials would deal with this question was to simply say, fine, if the College of Arts and Science was established first, we'll allocate X number of spaces to that college, and then a decreasing number to the colleges that came on board afterward. Well, I was the new college on board since I created a college at the university organized around the study of great books. I had absolutely no access to 6 o'clock. So I said, why don't we have a rational system? I go to a dean's meeting and I say, why don't we have a rational system? The rational system is based on pricing. If I can fill up a classroom that has 100 seats in it, and Dean X can only put 50 students into that classroom, I'm willing to pay a premium to get that classroom space because I'm going to get 100 students in that class. Pricing system. Very, very simple. The resistance was unbelievable. So I said, look, here's a very simple proposition. If you look at classroom allocation and space allocation in this academy, it's very, very simple to understand. There are virtually no classroom spaces that are used on Monday, none that are used on Saturday, and almost none that are used on Friday. So if you want a class to be given in those days, you don't have to pay for any space in the academy because the space is empty anyway. The student newspaper writes an article, London proposes classes on Friday, Saturday, and Monday. The faculty members in the university were ready for an auto da fe in Washington Square Park. They were going to burn me at the stake because there isn't a faculty member in the university who is at least a senior faculty member who doesn't have a 3-day work schedule. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. No one is there. I mean, if you are a full professor, you are not to be found on a Friday or a Monday, and certainly not on the weekend. So they only work 3 days a week. And when I suggested that maybe you have a class on a Friday, you consider working on a Friday, I was ready to be killed. It demonstrates something about the unique economics within the academy. That gentleman, then Michael.
I am Fahim Hashimi from Hudson Institute. My question was regarding the education system that you mentioned. For example, the student-centered education system in England and kind of SIME or full teacher-centered education system in the US and specifically in Afghanistan where I came from. How do you see the effectiveness of these systems comparison to each other? Which one would be more productive, whether if you implement the student-centered system could give good results or the teacher-centered system? Thank you.
Well, look, there used to be a philosophical view that has been discredited scientifically. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, that is, the life of the individual can be found through the species. It's obviously been discredited. And there's something to the notion, at least from a pedagogical point of view, that there's some truth in the idea that you can start with the individual, you can ask the individual questions. But ultimately, if you're an academy to emphasize the role of the individual, then why be there? I mean, my mother didn't go to higher education. She knew an awful lot about herself and how the world works. If you're going to be in the academy, you're there because you want the expertise of others that can provide it. If you're there largely because you feel it's simply a degree that I want, then of course you've got what I described before as the Wizard of Oz philosophy. So I do think that there's a combination of both. One, you can't lose sight of the individuals that you're addressing, and at the same time, you have to be aware of the fact that you're there because you want the expertise, the knowledge, the background, the experience of people who are standing in front of that room. Michael, you get the final word.
Well, I've taken the mic to see if I can't solicit a more happy, affirmative thought from the panel. Would it be fair to say that one of the benefits of the environment that you've described are the conservative students who learn the moral courage and the intellectual independence to think for themselves? Would it be fair to say that they may be the ones getting the best education? And when you look at Federalist Society leaders and the roles they're playing in the larger society, isn't that a kind of side benefit of the uniformity that you've described.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, and I know Ann probably has something to say about this as well. You have these alternative newspapers on campus, the Tory at Princeton, the Dartmouth Review, well-known newspapers, and they produce some extraordinary talented people who have now play a role in the media. Dinesh D'Souza, for example, was editor of the Dartmouth Review. So there's no question that you're correct, but they represent a tiny portion of the university population. And what I find disturbing is that if you happen to be, let's say, someone who's an evangelical at an Ivy League college today, you are chastised. It's difficult. It's very hard. Now, it's true those people are obliged to display a certain kind of courage if they want to be outspoken, and that's to be admired. But if you're talking about the future of higher education, at the moment, that represents a tiny portion of those who are in the academy.
Yeah, I think we should expect that all students going to colleges and universities be able to engage in thoughtful, robust exchange of ideas. And I think to the extent that that's not happening, there's obviously still work to be done.
On that note, I hope that's a cheerful note. I'd like to thank all of you for being here today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you've got to sign my books now.
Oh, you.